Okay, hi there. Welcome to the end of this week. Our last lesson for this week is going to be Unit 2, Lesson 6. We've been talking so much about oppression lately. So, what we're going to do today is start to talk about the reactions from the government. So, we've been talking about the reactions of the people that are being oppressed. But today we're going to start to pay attention to what the people that are a part of the government started to do because people started realizing, like, whoa, there's some big problems. We've got to do some stuff to go over it. So today we have a little bit of a longer set of notes. There's good news and bad news that goes along with that. The bad news is that it's going to take us a little bit longer to get through those notes. The good news is that the only assignment you have to do is fill out the guided notes as we are going through this lecture. So that's why I don't have the notes actually pulled up yet. When we are done with the notes and you're done completing the guided notes, you're going to submit those to me. And then there's no other required task for today. Now, your next test is coming up quickly. Today is Thursday. Your next test is on Tuesday of next week. So there are different options. You can either work on your extra credit study guide for Unit 2. You could watch some Unit 2 crash course videos to help you review the material. You can practice with your Unit 2 terms on Quizlet, or you can use this time to work on any missing assignments from Unit 2 that you might not have turned in yet. So after the notes are done for today, you've got the rest of the period to decide what it is you need to do with your time to be productive and to prepare to do the best that you can on the Unit 2 test. So I want to show you for the progressivism notes. They're just straight up guided notes. You're going to click here. You're going to open this up and make a copy. And then as I'm going through and you're watching this video, you're going to fill this information out. So obviously I would highly suggest that you have this video popped up on one screen, and then you have or not screen, but on one side of your screen, and then you have the guided notes popped up on the other side of the screen. And then you're going to fill this information in as we go along, and that'll be that. So we've got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about how not only the government, but the media also started responding to these different oppressive things that were happening during this time. So I'm going to go ahead and start doing the presentation. At this point, if you needed to, obviously pause the video, get your stuff open and situated, and get ready to fill this all in. So here we go. We're going to talk about the rise of progressivism. Now, if you look at the root word of progressivism, it is progress. So the idea of the progressive era was when we started to say, whoa, there are some bad things going on in what we have been referring to as the Gilded Era. And this was the time in which we see that oppression happening, and people are like, we need to turn this ship around, and we need to make sure that things are going to start going in a new direction. And this happens right around the turn of the century. So right around 1900, we kind of just burst into this new era that's going to take place. So let's start off by first talking about the goals of the progressive movement. There are some very basic goals of what people that were considered progressives wanted to see achieved. Number one, they want to continue to try to return control of government to the people as much as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea here is that we just really want the people to be able to have more of a say, especially at those local levels, like we talked about with the political machines yesterday. But just in general, people felt that at times even the government was being oppressive to them. So we needed to make sure that the people had more of a voice. The second goal of the progressive movement is to restore and improve economic opportunity. So much of what people are struggling with is the fact that they're not making enough money. The rich are getting richer and richer, and the poor continue to be poorer and poorer. And so we need to try and make sure that there are good economic opportunities for everybody, for those workers in the factories, for those farmers out in the fields. We want to make sure that we can make life successful for them. And then we wanted to focus on correcting the injustices in American life. So what we were saying about like child labor or women not being able to vote, things like that. Unfortunately, at this time, we did start off this unit by talking about African American oppression. And I can't say that there's much that goes on to help African Americans move forward. Almost every other area, government, life of farmers, life for women, life for workers, all of those other areas we talked about are going to see improvements. Unfortunately, African Americans and their rights are still kind of put on the back burner at this time. So women were the ones who were really picking up and having a larger role in this progressive era than we had ever seen before. Women were very interested in making sure that prohibition would be put into place. So again, remember, we're wanting to stop the use of alcohol, especially by their abusive husbands who are spending all of their money in the bar. So women are really at the center of prohibition. That didn't mean that men didn't support it. You just have women really at the center of that reform movement. Women, obviously, as we discussed, are out there fighting for suffrage and their right to be able to vote. A lot of women, as mothers, decide that it's really important for them to try and stop child labor. And we also see them working towards getting better working conditions and better hours for themselves. So as these things are happening, people start to take note of it. And so this is where we want to kind of get into the media role here. Now, obviously, you couldn't turn on Fox News or CNN and like see the atrocities of what was happening to different people on television. And you didn't have social media to be able to share that information, or even movies at this time with newsreels to share that information. So really the only way that people would find out about these things would be about reading about it. So that would be done in newspapers or through magazines. So we end up seeing the birth of investigative journalism, deep diving into some of this oppression and these bad things that are happening. And the journalists that go out and attack these oppressive actions that are taking place are given the term muckrakers. So you need to be familiar with the term muckraker. It's literally like they are raking up the muck, trying to clean up the nastiness that is out there and bring attention to it. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 different major muckrakers that you need to be familiar with. The first is a man by the name of Lincoln Steffens. Lincoln Steffens focused on urban reform. So those political machines that you learned about yesterday, this is where Steffens falls into that. He's trying to make sure that everybody sees the downside of the oppression that is happening within the large cities like Chicago and New York City and Boston and Philadelphia. And so he writes this book called The Shame of the Cities, where he basically calls them out for all of the bad things that they are doing. The next person is Jacob Riis. So Jacob Riis also focuses on urban reform. Specifically, though, he's focusing on the people that are living in poverty during this time. So he writes a book called How the Other Half Lives. It's got lots of photos in it of children living on the streets and just families living in squalor and poverty. And so this really brings attention to the middle and upper classes that don't travel to those sections of New York City, for example, to see those things. Like they know they're there, but they're not seeing the atrocities of what these people are going through. And so he writes this book, How the Other Half Lives, to kind of bring attention to that. And it is successful at trying to get people to say, you know what, maybe we should do more to raise money, to give to charity, to help out these different people that are struggling. Our third muckraker is a man by the name of Upton Sinclair. We're actually going to read a little piece of what he wrote in just a minute. His focus was on immigration and improving working conditions, especially in the meat packing industry. He writes a book called The Jungle, and it kind of details just how awful the conditions were for these people working in these horrible, horrible, wretched conditions, and then what people were actually being served to eat and stuff. So I'm going to go over that with you in just a second. The last one that I want to talk to you about is that other Ida. So if you remember way back in Unit 2, Lesson 1, I told you about Ida B. Wells, how she worked against lynching and how I wanted to make sure that you knew about notable women, and there would be another Ida that would pop up in this unit. Well, this is her. Ida Tarbell is the lady that we're talking about right now. She focused on exposing the oppressive nature of big businesses. Specifically, she went after Rockefeller and his oil industry. And so her goal was to try to make that reform happen, to stop the rich from being so incredibly powerful and influential and being able to basically like control the government because they had so much money and so much power. So she wanted to expose all of that. So she wrote the history of the Standard Oil Company, in which she goes out and basically attacks Rockefeller for his unfair business practices. I told you before, because there's two Idas, you got to remember the difference between the two. Ida B. Wells was the one who was working against lynching, African American woman. Ida Tarbell wrote against the oil industry. The easy way to remember which is that Ida Tarbell has the word tar in her last name. And that can usually be a good indicator and a clue to make you remember she's the one who wrote about oil, because she's got that word tar right there in her name. All right, moving on. Let me show you a little piece of what Upton Sinclair had to write. Now, in class, I would have read this to you and then gotten your reaction to it, but we're going to go through and read just a little bit of it. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm going to start down here where it says, there would be meat stored in great piles and rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poison bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, that poison bread, and the meat would all go into the hoppers together, which is like the grinders together. This is no fairy story, and this is no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and then people would like eat that meat, and it would be disgusting and awful and be created into sausage that people would then get very, very sick from eating. So when these muckrakers are writing stories like this, people are reading it and they are shocked, and they're like, okay, something's got to happen. Something has to change to fix these problems, because this is just disgusting. So we start seeing the call for more government reform. So that leads us into the government side of today's lesson and today's notes. So what we're going to do is spend the next bit of these notes talking about what these presidents during this time period actually did as a way to try and create some of this reform. We've talked about these presidents before in the last unit, but we focused on their foreign affairs and imperialism. Now we're going to focus in on their actual like domestic things, like what are they doing to help out here in the United States. So we're going to start off with Teddy Roosevelt. Now, before Teddy Roosevelt, we had gone quite a long time kind of just having presidents who were a little mediocre, didn't really have a whole lot of power, weren't pushing to use too much power. We were still, trying to get back together after the Civil War had happened. So really, Abraham Lincoln was like the last really big, powerful president. So Teddy Roosevelt comes in to be the president of the United States. And this is when we kind of see a return to power coming in. So he becomes president, as I told you in the last unit, after McKinley is assassinated. And he has an extremely powerful, charismatic, in your face kind of personality. And so he's quoted as saying the following: "It is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people, and to assume that he has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid him to do it." So in class, I would have asked you in a waterfall question at this point about what you think about the personality, and that's what you need to be putting in on your guided notes as well. I mean, you can see that he was somebody who's thought, you know what, it's the job of the president to be a strong leading commander. And again, very powerful personality, very, very in your face. So let's talk a little bit about what he did during this time. So Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, introduced what he referred to as the square deal. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, that's what TR stands for here, wanted to make sure that the common people, the everyday man, was going to be treated fairly, and he was vowing to fix a lot of these oppressive injustices that are out there. So his square deal consisted of what we would call the 3 C's. The first of those 3 C's is consumer protection. And this goes back to that jungle reference, the excerpt that I just read about like the meat packing industry and the rats and the sausage and the nastiness. And so during this time, he wants to bring attention to that and make sure that consumers are going to be protected. So we see during his presidency the passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act to make sure that food is going to be safe for people to be able to eat. Drugs in this instant is not talking about like recreational drugs. We're talking pharmaceuticals like medicine. Make sure that those things are now tested and actually safe for people to consume. And then also the Meat Inspection Act to make sure that the meat that you eat is inspected so it's safe. The second of those three C's is going to be the control of corporations. He did not like the fact that businesses were becoming so strong and so powerful. He totally supports capitalism and the fact that businesses should be able to be successful, but he doesn't think that they should wield too much power. So he is given the nickname as a trust buster. So a trust, as you learned back in Unit 1 when we talked about the growth of business, is kind of like a monopoly. Like it's just another fancy way of essentially discussing a monopoly. His idea is to go in and bust those up so that you don't have a monopoly and you don't have an industry that has too much power. He also gets involved with some union stuff that is happening at this point. He does a strike injunction in the coal strike of 1902. He passes a law called the Elkins Act that allows them to regulate and control railroads more so they aren't taking advantage of the farmers as much. So he's really just trying to make sure that businesses aren't taking too much power and oppressing their workers or oppressing the farmers as well, especially with that railroad industry. The third of those C's is conservation. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was an extreme outdoorsman. He grew up pretty much a very sickly child. He had asthma and couldn't really do a lot. And he decided he wasn't going to let that hold him back. And so he really focused on like being an outdoorsman and wanted to be rough and rugged and wasn't going to let his illness kind of like hold him back at all. And so being an outdoorsman, he really believed in the beauty of our country and wanted to make sure that we conserved it and that we didn't just start throwing skyscrapers up everywhere, all over the place and kind of creating these like urban jungles. And so under Teddy Roosevelt, as a way to also improve the country and put some reform in place, we see the creation of forest reserves, we see water power sites and wildlife sanctuaries, and the development of our national park system, which still exists today, to make sure that we've always got some land that is going to be protected. So here we've got, this is just a reminder, like this is your man, Teddy Roosevelt here, just so you remember what he looks like. And here you can see a political cartoon where it is titled The Lion Tamer. And we know that this is Teddy Roosevelt here. Again, you can tell by the mustache and the glasses like we see here. He's got this whip, and out of this tunnel, which is labeled Wall Street, you have all of these different lions coming out, and you'll see written on them are different titles. So Beef Trust, Oil Trust, Steel Trust. So again, this is him acting as that trust buster. He's the one that's kind of taming these big businesses, making sure that they aren't going to be so oppressive to the people anymore. So Roosevelt serves the rest of McKinley's term, which is basically like his entire term. And then he gets elected to a second term. And then, just as every other president has done since George Washington at this point, he respectfully bows out and he's like, that's 2 terms. I'm going to go. I'm going to pass on the torch to somebody else for this peaceful transfer of power, because that's what we're about in the United States. And so he decides that he's going to recommend a friend of his by the name of William Howard Taft to actually run for president. So I just said this. So he's elected in 1904, didn't run in 1908. So he puts William Howard Taft forward for the Republican nomination and says, this is your guy. This is the guy that's going to be the next best Republican to lead our party and to lead our country. I talked to you a little bit about this in the last unit when we talked about these presidents with imperialism, that Taft absolutely hated being president. He was too cautious. He didn't have that bold personality that Teddy Roosevelt had. He didn't have the the drive and the ambition, he was still a bit of a trust buster. So he still wanted to put some reform into place. He was just a very mild, bland version of what the previous president before him had been. And so as Taft's presidency goes on, he's more and more unhappy with the job and the role. It's not what he loves to do. But nonetheless, when 1912 comes around, he still decides, you know what? I'm going to keep running because that's what you do. If you're president for one term, you run for a second term, even if you're miserable in the job, because what man wants to really give up power, right? So he just didn't get that same support that Teddy Roosevelt had. So you can see a little bit of the like criticism that is here. We can see this is going to be Teddy Roosevelt peeking in the window. He's watching what Taft is doing. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt feels like he did a great job of really like doing a lot of reform and a lot of good for the country. And now he's kind of watching Taft like fumble and stumble all over the place. And he's like, dude, like I was trying to help you out. We were friends. And now he's realizing that Taft was not the right guy for this job, which is really kind of what we're seeing, Taft being a bit overwhelmed here in this political cartoon. So we get to the election of 1912, which is a really important election for you to be familiar with. Teddy Roosevelt, because he's upset with Taft's performance as president, he decides, you know what, I'm going to try to run for president again. There's nothing stopping him from doing that. So he's going to run for president again. There's no amendment as there is now that says you can only serve 2 terms. So he puts his name in there for the Republican nomination, but he doesn't get it because the Republican Party is going to back Taft because he's the Republican president at the time. So Taft wins the Republican nomination, but Teddy Roosevelt says, no, whatever, screw this. I'm still going to run for president. So he creates his own independent party, a third party that is referred to as the Progressive Party, also nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, because Teddy Roosevelt was getting up in years at this point, but he wanted everybody to know that he was still as fit as a bull moose and ready to run this country. And so he wanted everybody to continue to have their strength and trust in him. Here's what happens though. There's obviously a Democrat that's running as well. His name is Woodrow Wilson. So what happens is that you have half of the Republicans vote for Taft, the other half of the Republicans vote for Roosevelt, and then all the Democrats vote for Wilson, which allows Wilson to become the president because he's the one who's going to win the vote because the Republicans split their votes up. So it ends up causing Woodrow Wilson to actually become president. Whereas if Teddy Roosevelt wouldn't have run, we probably would have seen Taft get elected to another term because the Republican Party was simply the more popular party at this time. So you can see here just another political cartoon to look at. In 1908, we're seeing Teddy Roosevelt hand over the nomination to Taft. And then in 1912, we're seeing that bit more rugged idea of who Teddy Roosevelt is, putting the gun to Taft's face and being like, hand me that nomination back. I want to be president again. You're screwing this whole thing up. You can see here the electoral map from the election of 1912. All of these blue states are the states that Wilson was able to win, and he was able to win all of those because of that split here in the vote. So you can see 23% of the people voted for Taft, 27% of the people voted for Roosevelt. Now, if you would have added those two together, it would have beat out Wilson. However, that split causes Wilson to be able to get a pretty good win. Now, I know this is a long set of notes. This is why I'm not going through and having you do another assignment for today, but just stick with me. We are almost done. We've got 2 slides left and that's it. So Wilson is now elected president of the United States. And during his presidency, he does have some success. Now, I told you in the last unit, he's not my favorite president. He's a white supremacist, totally, not personally a guy that I like, but as president, he really wasn't that bad of a president. So he does some good reform things during his time. The Clayton Antitrust Act is going to be passed during his presidency, which is an extension of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which all you need to see here is that it says antitrust. We're talking about breaking up those monopolies more. During Wilson's presidency, we see the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. which was creating a watchdog agency to investigate regulation violations, making sure that businesses were following regulations that were being put into place. And then we also see the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, which created a central bank of the United States to help control the money and the money supply for the US that is still used today. The very last thing I want to talk to you about is that during this time, we're seeing all of these people fight for this oppression to go away. And there is some success and changes to the Constitution. Now, these happened during the Wilson presidency, but they were being fought for throughout Roosevelt's presidency, throughout Taft's presidency. People were fighting for these amendments to be added to the Constitution. The first one is that we needed the government to be able to have more money to put reforms and stuff in place and to be able to take care of the people. So we see the push for an income tax that is added to the Constitution in 1913 with the creation of the 16th Amendment. I remember the 16th Amendment typically by remembering that most teenagers are about 16 years old when you get your first job. And when you get that job, you got to start paying those income taxes just like the rest of us. Next, we have the 17th Amendment. Remember the 17th Amendment, or not 17th, one of the goals of the progressive movement was to put more power back in the hands of the people. And so we see the passing of the 17th Amendment, which now allowed people to elect the senators for their states. Before this, it was up to the legislative branch of each state to choose those people. And some of those people were like selling those seats off, and it was being, a bit shady as to how senators were getting their jobs. This put it in the hands of the people. I remember the 17th Amendment by remembering Senate teen, because it sounds like 17. So when I see 17, I think Senate teen, and then I remember this is the one that deals with people electing the senators. The 18th Amendment was a big success for women, especially because we see the institution of prohibition. So alcohol completely out, completely illegal. It's going to stay that way for more than a decade. That doesn't mean people aren't drinking. We'll talk more about that in Unit 3. But the 18th Amendment is passed and seen as a big success for the progressive movement and for reforms. And then women have even more success with the passing of the 19th Amendment, which we talked about back in Unit 2, Lesson 2. And we see women's suffrage come forward and women start to be able to vote in 1920. So I know this was a long set of notes. I know this was a lot to kind of like process, but really what I wanted you to see was the changes and the way that people are reacting to this oppression and what we are doing about it, how we are trying to go through and fix it, and what the progressive era was all about. On Monday of next week, we will wrap up Unit 2 and you will focus on completing an assignment in which you are going to look at very specific reforms that were made so you can see more of the tangible examples of like, these people were suffering, we did this to improve it. These people were suffering, we did this to improve it. So that'll be our focus in our next lesson. That brings us to the end of the notes. As I said, once you're done with the guided notes and filling them in, you need to go through and complete it and make sure that you turn it in. And then after that, any time that you have left in class, you need to spend working on preparing for your test. If you have any questions, as always, let me know. You know that I'm here for you, and I will see you guys in the next lesson. Bye, y'all.